You're gonna have to bail me out of jail. She has a boyfriend now who's in the military. He's actually dead. She's died in Iraq. I'm gonna go kill that.
Disturbing comments from Nick Reiner in 2016.
Based on the information we now have, Nick Reiner is not going to plead guilty to these murders. He is going to plead not guilty by reason of insanity, and here's why. We have learned that Nick Reiner was diagnosed with schizophrenia.
I got like 100 personality disorder.
Nick, who was arrested Sunday, is accused of using a knife to kill his parents at their LA home. That video, posted to his YouTube account in 2016, now resurfacing in the days following Rob and Michelle's deaths.
His behavior in the month before the murders was erratic and dangerous. He went to an LA rehab facility in the time before the murders, specializes in treating mental illness. It's really expensive. It costs $70,000 a month.
Nick, who's battled drug addiction and mental illness most of his life, films himself smoking and shows off what appears to be illegal substances throughout the video.
You bought heroin off a transvestite?
His younger sister, Romy, who discovered their parents' bodies after the murders, even makes a cameo, puffing on what appears to be a cigarette.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
According to page 6, about a month before the killings, doctors reportedly changed Nick's meds, at which point he became out of his head. They were reportedly in the process of adjusting his meds to stabilize him when tragedy struck. I think a lot of people are going to cotton on to this, especially Alan Jackson, Nick's defense lawyer, because this provides a little wiggle room to say the medications murdered Rob and Michelle, and Nick was just an innocent bystander. Also, the medications wanted to get away with murder, Nick didn't, so they ordered him to flee from the scene and try to escape. Not because he had guilty knowledge, because the medications were running the show. The lights are on, but nobody's home. I just think if Rob and Michelle told Nick he was going back to rehab, do you think the medications puppeted him to commit murder, pulled his strings, or do you think Nick, when he was completely sober and not in any institution, said he really didn't want to go back to rehab? I do think this news about schizophrenia may lead to there not even being a court case. There may instead be a plea deal and Nick skipping prison and instead serving time in a mental health facility. Did you know the Yorkshire Ripper Peter Sutcliffe, a serial killer who murdered at least 13 women in Manchester, West Yorkshire, he relied on exactly this defense, diminished responsibility, and even prosecutors intended to accept his plea after 4 psychiatrists diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia. At the end of this episode, I'll tell you what the courts ultimately decided in that case, because in terms of legal intertextualities, it may well have a bearing on this one. And look at this headline from the LA Times. Rob Reiner and his son exorcised drug demons with Being Charlie at Toronto Film Festival. Several hours before this story broke that Nick Reiner was being treated for schizophrenia, I had already mentioned it on this channel. Not that he was being treated, but the fact that schizophrenia is a classic symptom of meth use and meth addiction. Have a look at this from neuroscienceresearchinstitute.com. Meth use can cause considerable physical and mental harm. The negative effects of chronic meth use can cause hallucinations and delusions and trigger schizophrenia. It's interesting that you don't really see the word meth associated with Nick, though. You see cocaine, you read about heroin, and I'm not saying it's not there at all, just that it's not as central as it should be, in my opinion, to this narrative. It is in the odd headlines such as this one. Rob Reiner's son Nick was likely on meth when he allegedly killed his parents. Well, I agree with that. And this one. Dr. Drew says Rob Reiner's son was likely using meth.
This is wild behavior. This is not a brain that's working normally. But on the streets of Los Angeles every day, there are people wielding machetes and knives. Meth addicts tend to go for those sorts of objects. Now, we've heard that Rob Reiner's son had heroin addiction. The interesting thing I have is that he's also on stimulants such as methamphetamine.
Clearly, something was very wrong with Nick's mental state on Saturday, 13th December. That's why Rob wanted to keep an eye on him. But witnesses at that same party clearly encountered someone with a few screws loose as well. Have a look at this headline from page 6. The unsettling reason Rob Reiner's son Nick attended Conan O'Brien's Christmas party. Nick was apparently staring at people, interrupting a private conversation that was with Bill Hader, and making guests at the party uncomfortable. Why? Because this is really specific. He was asking them 3 questions: their name, their surname, and whether they were famous. As crazy as this sounds, I think it was integral to the issue that was haunting Nick not only at the time, but his entire life. It basically cuts to the heart of his gripe with the world, that his father was absurdly famous, and because Nick's first name wasn't Rob, he wasn't famous. And I think Nick's knee-jerk psychology to this was to sort of interrogate folks. Basically, if your first and last name were such and such, then you were such and such famous. This may sound like absurd arithmetic, and it is, but that's also the absurd, not quite real world he was living in, which is Brentwood. By the way, Brentwood is less than 20 miles from Hollywood, less than a half-hour drive through the Hollywood Hills. The giant wound in Nick's life was that he was a nobody, or more accurately, he felt like a nobody, and his father's renown sort of rubbed that in. And I think to some extent the growing, I wouldn't say renown, but the growing influence of both his siblings, his elder brother and his younger sister. If he wanted what his father had, well, he fell short, and he knew it, and he couldn't seem to do anything about it. But if his father could do it, why couldn't he? I mean, if you live by the sword, you die by the sword. And for Nick, the sword was fame, and that fame was substance. For a YouTuber, the sword might be subscriber numbers, but mark my words, be very careful what sword you attribute value to or for yourself, because it may well end up stabbing you in the back. That sword that you attribute value may ultimately invalidate you, or may seem that way. Now, coming back to that mental health conversation, which comes first, mental illness or addiction? I think the opposite question here isn't a generic question, it's whether Nick Reiner had mental health issues all along. Did he have schizophrenia as a kid? I doubt it. Generally, when it comes to adults, committing a crime while under the influence is an aggravating factor. With minors, it isn't necessarily, but it can be a mitigating factor. And I think we're going to see that with the Anna Kepner case, because often adults who enable the intoxication, such as also the store who sold underage Paul Murdaugh liquor on the night Mallory Beach died, they are often held liable instead. I don't think that's going to be the case here. And by the way, if Brian Koberg is watching and all of this is going to work, perhaps he can appeal his conviction on the same grounds. And Alec Murdaugh as well, wasn't he addicted to substances when he committed double murder against his family? Doesn't that mean he's off the hook? If the mere suggestion of that turns your stomach, and it does mine, because the one thing addicts demand is diminished responsibility. They don't want to be responsible for anything. And you want to give them that? A let-off under these circumstances? Double murder of his own parents. And if the mere suggestion of that turns your stomach, if it gets you off your gourd, how do you feel about Nick murdering his parents and then inheriting the means from them to defend himself? And that then brings us to those 3 crazy questions. But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please do hit the thanks button, and let's get started with those 3 questions. Right, so 3 crazy questions. Number 1, has Nick ever had a girlfriend? The answer seems to be no, doesn't it? So far, we haven't been able to find a single photo or footage of Nick with a girl. But if you dig a little deeper, apparently a scene in the movie Being Charlie dramatizes Nick hooking up with a fellow addict while in rehab. This is according to the LA Times. In the movie, matters appear to be moving in the right direction until a romance with the woman Charlie meets in rehab Morgan Saylor complicates those efforts. If anything, it appears his romance with a fellow addict didn't improve his attitude to rehab, but the opposite. We also know Nick had an unusual plan at the tender age of 14 to lose his virginity. According to the Washington Post, at around age 14, he stole $200 from his parents and lost his virginity to someone he paid for sex through a Craigslist ad. Now, I don't know about you, but just about everything about that sounds extreme to me. Maybe I'm old school, but, just like the murders last weekend are extreme as well. So think about it, stealing $200 from his parents, having sex with a prostitute at 14 years old. Just think about that, losing your virginity with a prostitute at 14. Think about what can go wrong there, the diseases you can pick up before your sex life really even gets started. According to the Washington Post, a year later he told listeners he went to rehab for the first of what would become more than 15 stints in similar treatment. That is also extreme. I don't know what a normal run is for visits to rehab, but 18 or 19, that's the final tally. That sounds on the high side, the very, very high side to me. Meanwhile, at 16, he smoked crack at an Alcoholics Anonymous conference in Atlanta. Again, extreme, along with living on the streets for weeks that I believe turned into months. That is an extreme thing to experience and an extreme thing to do to avoid rehab, only to still end up going to rehab almost 20 times, not in 20 years, but I think in 5 years. So to answer the question, did Nick ever have a girlfriend? I doubt he's ever had a meaningful romantic relationship in his life with the opposite sex. But if he has, clearly not recently. And so one wonders if one should think of him in a way as an incel. Did he think of himself in that way? And I wonder if this was eating at him as well at the time, because that's one of the ways a woman evaluates a man. What do you have to offer? Who are you? And what did Nick have to offer? And who was he? And what was he except borrowed veneer from his famous father? And that brings us to number 2. Has Nick ever had a job? And that might be a question a prospective girlfriend might ask. And I think not having a job and not having a girlfriend go hand in hand. It seems both of Nick's siblings are actors and have worked as actors, and both his siblings are attractive, more attractive than he is. And I think having a job and holding a job, that's a sign of maturity. That's a sign of taking responsibility. That's a sign of having a sense of value and having an identity. Another question that goes hand in hand with this one is, did Nick ever study and get some sort of qualification? Did he ever apply himself in any particular area besides drug addiction? Because his older brother did. As you can see from Jake's LinkedIn profile, have a look at this. Actor, writer, producer. And then Jake studied broadcast journalism at Syracuse University. Did Nick? And while Nick was cycling in and out of rehab since the age of 14, Jake worked as a reporter and an actor. Just look at this going back in time. Actor, news reporter, KCBS, news reporter, KPRC, multimedia journalist, weekend anchor, KION, news intern, blogger for the Huffington Post, anchor reporter, intern for NBC, and so it goes on. Meanwhile, Romy has her own page on IMDb and 3 recent acting credits by the look of it. Nick does too. He also features on IMDb, but his stars seem to rise and fall at around the same time. 2015, 2016, that's 9-10 years ago. Remember, 2017 is when Nick trashed the guest house. And look at one of the quotes from that page, from that IMDb page. It reads as follows. All I ever wanted was a way to kill the noise. What about the noise when someone says, sort out your life or go to rehab? And I guess the message is clear. If you ask me to do something and I don't want to do it, suffer the consequences. I might just trash the place. And so isn't that a kind of manipulation, a kind of coercion, where you are too scared to intervene or confront him? Well, I would be, wouldn't you? Nick's stint working on a script with his father, does that sort of self-indulgence count as a job? It might if it led to other jobs, but I'm not sure if it did. We know Nick was living in the family guest house at the time of the murders and had been for something like 5 years. It might even be longer. That incident in 2017 when he smashed up the guest house was 7 years ago, so he was living there then as well. Here's the part that Nick apologists miss. It's the sound reasoning that leads to the incident. He said that his parents had told me I had to go just prior to the incident, just prior to trashing the guest house. So if the reasoning, the motive, in other words, makes sense, why doesn't the act itself? And I can bet you the reasoning, the motive for Nick trashing the guest house is going to be similar to whatever set him off on Saturday night going into Sunday morning. He just made a huge scene, and whatever treatment he was on wasn't working, and he was behaving strangely. Was he behaving strangely because his medication had been changed or because he was high? Maybe both. But the last time he had been extremely blind out of his mind violent was because he was on meth. And I think a blood test will reveal whether he was on meth at the time of the murders and to what extent. And let me ask you this. If each time you drink a can of Coke, you crash your car, at what point is crashing the car the can of Coke's fault? At what point does it become your fault? Because eventually you should know what happens when you drink a can of Coke. Or can you blame a can of Coke in this hypothetical indefinitely? And this is the part where I don't accept a mental health get out of jail card. It's the recidivism that goes back years and years. And what is also schizophrenic about this story is that there seems to be a period, especially the period when father and son successfully work together, where they repair their relationship and make a movie together. And the movie seems to be about the son being right and the father being wrong. But so wasn't he schizophrenic then? If he was able to write a screenplay and get the job done, wasn't he of sound mental health then? Oh, so when he commits a crime, then he isn't. Oh, okay. But can't we say that of every single crime and every single criminal that has ever lived then? That when they committed the crime, their mental health wasn't very good. So should we send their mental health to prison, but not them? Oh, okay. When I last looked, whose responsibility is your and my mental health? Is it always someone else's? So I think the bottom line to the question whether Nick Reiner had a job is that mostly he did not. And I don't think you can blame schizophrenia for that. And if you can go through rehab and come clean out the other side, if you can write a successful screenplay for a movie that is ultimately produced, then I think you can take responsibility for your own actions. The choice is yours. And that brings us to the third and final question. How is Nick able to afford a crack defense lawyer? Well, he shouldn't. But according to the Latin maxim, nullus commodum capere potest de injuria sua propria, basically means no one can take advantage of their own wrong. Another one is qui causa mortis testatoris fuit a beneficio ex testamento removetur. Whoever was the criminal cause of the testator's death is removed from the benefit of the will. The Roman Dutch translation is de bloedige hand neemt geen erfs. It basically means the bloody hand should not inherit. It's an ironic legal aphorism given that Nick himself once remarked, also with irony, I never thought I'd capitalize on Rehab. That's in terms of this movie that he made. And so is he capitalizing on his drug addiction where he kills his parents, allegedly, and then he gets paid money for his defense? Well, technically, neither should he be allowed to capitalize profit or benefit in any way from the murders of his parents. So if the law prohibits this, why does it seem to be happening? I mean, he seems to have Alan Jackson on the payroll, actively working for him. How is that taking place? According to the New York Post, Nick's ability to cobble together funds to pay for a legal defense could be contingent on his siblings, Jake and Romy, or anyone else. That could be family people, uncles, aunts, anyone who's connected to Rob Reiner's will or trust. And it's been rumored that Nick's family want him, if convicted, to serve time in a mental health facility, not prison. That would make 100% sense just because the theme of Nick's life thus far has been soft living. It's the equivalent of him living in the guest house as opposed to on the streets, living in a mental health facility rather than a prison. And so it makes sense that those around him might want him to have as soft and as cushy a sentence as possible if convicted. And that's especially likely if those around him sort of got used to the drug narrative and have basically told themselves all along that he had a mental illness, and that is what is responsible for this particular case.
In the 3 to 4 weeks leading up to the murders, Nick's medications were changed. And they were changed because he was exhibiting more and more erratic and dangerous behavior. But when they were changed, they weren't right.
The more I think about it, the more I think Nick's defense lawyer actually has a chance of defending him. One clever way is trying to get former addicts or people with addicts in their family or a spouse perhaps on the jury. Chances are, especially a former addict, will sympathize with Nick and will buy into a defense that Nick's mental health killed Rob and Michelle, not Nick. That Nick has always been along for the ride and his mental health has sort of been in the driving seat, steering the ship all along. Funny that if Nick's mental health was so shitty, how did he know to go on the run? And also, how was he able to cobble together a movie with his father if he was basically mentally disabled? Even so, I think there's a huge audience out there that like to rationalize addiction as a symptom of mental health issues rather than the other way around, that mental health suffers as a result of addiction. The addict starts off with perfect mental health and then amnesia and self-pity set in. Of course, you can't have a substance use disorder without being addicted. But I guess as soon as you are addicted, you can hide behind the fact that you have a substance use disorder, which explains why you continue using it. It's not you that's addicted, it's the disorder that's addicted. Oh, okay. So let's get back to that original question. What happened when prosecutors accepted the idea that the Yorkshire Ripper be excused from a prison sentence? The prosecution intended to accept Sutcliffe's plea after 4 psychiatrists diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia, but the trial judge, bless him, Justice Sir Leslie Boreham, demanded an unusually detailed explanation of the prosecution's reasoning. And after a 2-hour representation by the Attorney General, Sir Michael Havers, a 90-minute lunch break and another 40 minutes of legal discussion, Justice Boreham rejected the diminished responsibility plea and the expert testimonies of the psychiatrists, insisting that the case should be dealt with by a jury. The trial proper was set to commence on 5th May 1981. Sutcliffe's trial lasted about 2 weeks, and despite the efforts of his counsel, was found guilty of murder on all counts and was sentenced to 20 concurrent sentences of life imprisonment. 20 concurrent sentences for life actually only amounts to 1 life sentence, unfortunately. Incidentally, Sutcliffe did serve quite some time in a mental hospital, but ultimately returned to prison and died while serving his sentence in prison at the age of 74. What is going to happen in this case in California? Well, time will tell. Well, I'm not going to take it further than that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.